All right, pre-AP biology. Today I want to continue with the immune system. Last week we talked a little bit about active immunity, how your body will actually build up immunity to a disease. So today I want to just kind of continue talking about some other topics involving your immune system, starting with something called an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune diseases are basically things that trigger your immune system to attack healthy body cells. So it says here it occurs when immune systems cannot tell self, like your own body cells, from non-self. They have trouble identify. Your white blood cells have trouble identifying, um, your own name tags, your own marker proteins. So if that happens, there are certain diseases that are caused by that. One of them you might have heard of before. It's called type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is basically caused by an autoimmune disease when antibodies, your own antibodies, attack insulin producing cells in the pancreas. Your pancreas produces insulin, so when your own immune system attacks those cells, then problems can arise. So that's what type 1 diabetes is. Rheumatoid arthritis. This again is an autoimmune disease where the antibodies will attack like cells in your joints of your like elbows and knees and hips and things like that. And it's kind of a debilitating disease. And then finally, multiple sclerosis or MS. This is where the antibodies will attack nerve cells in your brain and spinal cord. Right? So autoimmune. The biggest thing about them is you should know like it's kind of a unique type of disease. It's your own immune system attacking your healthy body cells. And you should be able to give maybe one or two examples of those diseases. All right. Allergies. I'm sure a lot of you have allergies. In fact, I have some allergies. You might be allergic to, things like, I don't know, certain types of foods or mold or pollen or, dust, whatever. But an allergy is basically your immune system responding to something that's not pathogenic. I mean, for example, like pollen, pollen from flowers or things like that. I mean, if you breathe that in, I mean, pollen doesn't cause diseases. It's not like it's a pathogen, but your body thinks that it is. All right, we call those things allergens. Allergens are basically things that cause allergies. They cause your immune system to respond like it would be if it was trying to fight off a disease. So one of the things that your immune system will do is it will release histamine. We talked about this during the inflammation response, like you get a splinter in your finger. But in this case, it's like, you know, a whole bunch of cells are releasing this. And this is kind of how your body tries to get rid of these allergens. So you get like running noses, watery eyes, you sneeze a lot, you might break out in hives or something like that. I mean, but that's all because of the histamine that your body is releasing. It's causing this, massive response to try to get rid of this pathogen. Now they do have drugs, they're called antihistamines, that will suppress the immune system. They'll kind of shut off, the release of histamine for several hours, maybe up to 24 hours, depending on the pill that you take. Things like Benadryl and things like that. But again, they're only temporary; they only work for a certain amount of time, and also your body can kind of get used to those after a while, and they kind of won't really be that effective over a long period of time. But I mean, they are somewhat effective to reduce the amount of histamine. But pretty much, if you're an allergy sufferer, you kind of know what I'm talking about. When your body's releasing this histamine, you kind of know how you feel. So here again is just some things that might cause or trigger those allergies. Asthma. Asthma. The one thing about it, I just kind of like to talk about it when I talk about allergies because allergies can trigger asthma attacks. But it is the leading cause of serious illness amongst children, so that's kind of an important thing to remember. It's caused by the narrowing of air passages. I'll show you a picture of this in a second. And if your air passages narrow, you basically can't breathe. If any of you guys have asthma or have ever have asthma attacks, you kind of know how that feels. It can be triggered by stress, There's a lot of environmental factors, including allergens. There's what we call sports-induced asthma, where if you're working out extensively, and it could trigger an asthma attack. There's even genetic factors involved in that. There is medication that you can take. It's usually a steroid, and I'll tell you what the steroid does in a couple of minutes. But it needs to be taken through kind of like an inhaler. So here's a picture of these are called bronchial tubes, and these are like major air passages in your lungs. If you look down here, look at this picture here. Here's your trachea. This is your windpipe, and that kind of branches off into these little brachial tubes or bronchial tubes. The one on the right here, this one is kind of a clear one. Like this is where air can. It's almost like a straw. Like air can just kind of travel through it pretty easily. Whereas over here, you can see how it's become much narrower. All right, and that's all due to these bronchial tubes kind of tightening up, and they release a bunch of mucus, and it's really difficult to breathe. In fact, some people that have asthma attacks feel like they're suffocating; they just can't get a breath. So what the steroid does, what the medication does, is it relaxes this tube. It allows it to kind of open up, and it allows air to pass through. So that's kind of what they do, but I don't know much about the medication itself other than it does help to relax and open that tube up. There might be side effects of it or something. I'm not really sure, but without that medication, these people would really suffer. So it's kind of important that they have that. The immune system and cancer. This is something I think is kind of important. We talked earlier in the year about what cancer is. Cancer is basically when cells divide abnormally, and then they can metastasize and enter the bloodstream, and they can spread to other parts of your body. But one of the functions of your immune system is to kind of spot that and check it, see if that's happening anywhere in the body. You have little white blood cells that again travel through your bloodstream, and they kind of act as sort of like a surveillance camera. In fact, we have a big fancy name for this. It's called immunological surveillance. And what immunological surveillance basically is your immune system checking for cancer, checking to see if there's any cells that are dividing abnormally. And if they are, your immune system will basically get rid of those things. So that's a really good um, um, function of our immune system, is to check and try to detect cancer cells before they can become too dangerous. Now, I will say this, that this immunological surveillance, it's not always 100% effective because people get cancer, obviously. So, I mean, can some cancer cells, fly under the radar and kind of go undetected? Yeah, they can, and that's one of the issues with this. But I mean, um, this is a function of the immune system. So, I would rather have this than not have it, right? All right. Now, the last thing today I want to talk about a little bit is just how certain types of pathogens actually cause diseases. I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about how bacteria cause diseases. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk a little bit about how viruses cause disease, because they are different types of pathogens, and they're not the only pathogens. There's funguses and worms and things like that, but bacteria and viruses, I think, are two really big things that you guys kind of need to know. Now, before we kind of get into bacteria, I mean, we kind of know what they are, but like how they cause disease, it's important to kind of know what bacteria need to survive, right? Because if we know what they need to survive, if we can take those things away, then we can kind of control their growth, and we can maybe stop them from causing disease. So, I mean, let's just, I don't know, use common sense. I mean, bacteria, what do they need to survive? They need food. I mean, these are organisms that do depend on it, and most of them aren't autotrophic, at least the ones that live in our body and cause diseases. These are heterotrophic organisms, so they have to have a food source. They need water, and they need the right climate. They need a certain temperature at which they function best. So if we remove these things, if we can alter these in any way, then we can really control how well the bacteria grow. If we provide them with all the food they need and all the water they need and the right climate, then bacteria are going to reproduce like crazy. So these are what we call limiting factors. They do limit the growth and the reproductive rate of bacteria. And if we remove those things, then they're not going to be able to do those things. All right, so let's talk about some different ways that we can actually control their growth. A couple terms here. Freezing, we kind of know what that means. Pasteurizing, you may not know what that means, but we'll talk about it. Dehydrating and sanitizing. Now, these are four major ways that we can control the growth of bacteria. Freezing, I think it's quite obvious what we do there, right? When you go and buy some foods from the grocery store, like dairy products or meat or eggs, like we put those things in the refrigerator, right? We tend to cool them off. We don't want to leave those things out on the counter for too long. And we do that because we're trying to control the growth of the bacteria. And freezing does, or refrigeration does. It at least slows it down. For example, let's say you have a gallon of milk that you put in the refrigerator versus a gallon of milk that you just let sit on the kitchen counter, for a couple of days. You tell me which one's going to spoil first, right? The one that's being exposed to the air, the one that's in the warmer climate. So the reason why is because the bacteria that are in that milk are still going to reproduce much faster if they're at a warmer temperature than if they're at a colder temperature. So, if we let the foods thaw out, if we let them get up to room temperature, then those bacteria are going to reproduce like crazy. Pasteurizing. Pasteurizing is using heat to kill bacteria. A great example is milk production. Right here, right? This is basically how we get milk from a cow, right? It's not like they just take that milk, they just put it right into a gallon jug and just ship it off to the grocery store. They have to pasteurize this milk first. So what they'll do is they'll basically put it into these they're almost like big pots, and they basically just boil it. They boil the milk, they heat it up to kill all the bacteria. Now, again, does it kill all the bacteria? No, there's still probably some in there. That's why they have to put an expiration label on the on the milk. Like when you go buy a gallon of milk, it'll say whatever June 1st. That means by June 1st, the bacteria that are in that milk may have reproduced to an unsafe level. So it's always good to kind of smell it to make sure it doesn't smell. That's usually kind of an indicator that there's too many bacteria in there. You may not want to drink it. But pasteurizing is a good way to kill a lot of the bacteria, but doesn't necessarily kill them all. Some of them may have survived the pasteurizing process. Dehydrating is very simple. It's just removing water from food. We don't really worry too much about bacteria growing on foods like these because these foods are all dehydrated. There's no water in them. All right, so that's just a way to kind of control their growth. Sanitizing and disinfecting. There's two terms here that we have to know. The term antiseptic. These are chemicals that are used on living tissue. Think hand sanitizer. Hand sanitizer is a disinfectant. Mouthwash. Mouthwash is a disinfectant. Bactine that you might put on, like, let's say you skin your elbow. You want to clean the cut. That would be an antiseptic. Even things like hand soap. That as well. Disinfectants are used on non-living surfaces. So like toilet bowl cleaner, that would be a disinfectant. You wouldn't use that as mouthwash, right? You wouldn't want to rub that on your hands. All right, toilet bowl cleaner. The wipes that you wipe your desks down with every time you walk in the classroom, those are disinfectants. All right, or at least that chemical is a disinfectant. So that's used to control the growth of pathogens on non-living surfaces. All right, so let's talk a little bit about harmful bacteria. You know, we use this term pathogen, right? Any organism that can cause disease. What I do want you to understand is that not all bacteria are pathogens. There are some bacteria that are like really beneficial. You've got bacteria that live in your stomachs, for example, that are actually helping you digest food. Those are really important bacteria that we have. There's bacteria that are used to make food, like yogurt, for example. Yogurt, they use bacteria to make it. There's some bacteria that are really beneficial. The nitrogen cycle that we talked about earlier in the year, that's all driven by bacteria. Plants have to have nitrogen, if bacteria don't provide that for them, then plants can't grow. So, not all bacteria are disease causing, but some of them are. So we're going to talk about some of those today. Not all pathogens are bacteria. So, I mean, yes, some bacteria are pathogenic, but there again are other organisms like viruses and worms and things like that that can also cause disease. Now, once bacteria get into your body, they can basically cause disease one of two ways. All right, number one, they can just use your cells as a food source. I mean, they can destroy cells and tissues, like strep throat bacteria, for example. I mean, those bacteria are using some of the cells in the back of your throat as a food source. And that's why you kind of don't feel very good. Your throat's kind of scratchy, and you want to get rid of those things. Other bacteria will release toxins, they'll release chemicals, and those chemicals can actually damage body cells. So it depends on the type of bacteria, but these are just two different ways that they can actually cause active disease. Modes of disease transmission. How can bacteria be spread from one person to another? In this case, contaminated water. Sometimes these bacteria will get into a water supply, and if people are using that water supply as a drinking source, then they can contract that disease. They can be spread through the air, sneezing. They can just travel through the air through air currents, and another person can breathe it in. So that's another way. Contaminated food. Things like botulism and salmonella. These are food-borne illnesses that people can get. Animal vectors, like, for example, mosquitoes, different types of insects, even things like rats, that can pass disease from one person to the next. Then finally, just human contact, things like kissing, sexual contact, shaking hands. All of these things are ways that, again, diseases can be spread from one person to the next. Some bacteria, not all, but some, can form structures called endospores. Endospores are formed anytime the external conditions are kind of unfavorable for the bacteria. Like, for example, freezing. If it gets too cold out, sometimes these bacteria will form these structures called endospores. Endo means inside. And what an endospore basically is kind of a protective barrier around the DNA of the organism of the bacteria. And what will happen when this endospore forms? It's almost kind of like the bacteria kind of goes into hibernation. We call that dormancy. So, like, the bacteria won't be, I'm not going to say alive, but it won't be active when those conditions are unfavorable. But let's say, for example, conditions become favorable, then what will happen is that endospore will kind of disintegrate, and then the DNA will become active again, and then the bacteria will kind of emerge and become alive after that. So the thing about these endospores is a lot of times they're really light. They can be carried by the wind or by the water. They can be moved from one place to the next. A really good example of this is something called anthrax. Anthrax is a bacteria that forms an endospore that is super duper light. It's almost like almost like a powder, and it can just be kicked up into the air, and it can be blown, and it's a pretty bad disease. You don't want to contract that one. All right, here's just a list of just some of the, I'm not going to say common bacterial diseases. Some are common, some aren't, but some of these have some historical impacts as well. Tuberculosis. We've talked about this one before. Back we watched the movie on evolution. This is one that infects the lungs. Meningitis. There's actually two different types of meningitis. There's bacterial meningitis. There's also viral meningitis. But meningitis infects something called the meninges, which is a covering around your brain and around your spinal cord. And if that becomes inflamed, if it becomes diseased, it could actually put pressure on the brain, and it can kill you. So this is a really bad disease. You don't want to get meningitis. Syphilis, this is a sexually transmitted disease, or STD. There are several bacterial STDs out there. Syphilis, gonorrhea is another one. Um, Again, those are passed through sexual contact. Bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. This one wiped out, like half of Europe back in the 14th century. Strep throat, I think we kind of know what that is. Tooth decay, these are caused by bacteria, so brush your teeth because bacteria can get into any little nook or any little crack or hole in your tooth. They can form cavities. Tetanus, maybe you guys have had a tetanus shot before. That's usually contracted when you cut yourself on like a rusty object. Cholera. This one is more common in developing countries. It is an intestinal bacteria, and it basically is contracted through drinking contaminated water. Lyme disease, maybe you've heard of this one, is caused by a tick. It's an animal vector. And then finally, botulism and salmonella. These are different types of food poisoning. But again, these are all caused by bacteria. Now, preventing the diseases, a couple big things here. I mean, vaccines. We should remember how a vaccine works, right? Vaccines are basically just dead or weakened pathogens that we inject into the body to trigger that immune response. We talked about this on Friday. So, I mean, there are some vaccines for bacterial diseases. Antibiotics. Antibiotics are basically drugs that usually are derived from like a fungus, in some cases from other bacteria. But these are basically drugs that will kill um, other bacteria. So, like penicillin, for example. Penicillin. This picture here is showing us these little discs, and these discs are soaked in penicillin or some type of antibiotic. You'll notice all these little dots. These dots are little bacterial colonies. But you'll notice around those discs, you don't see anything growing. That's because the chemical that that disc is soaked in will inhibit the growth of bacteria around it. So what we figured out to do is we can take these chemicals, we can put them in pill form, put them in the body, and again, they will stop bacteria from growing inside the body. One of the big issues with antibiotics, though, is antibiotic resistance, right? Some of these bacteria have become resistant, and we've kind of driven the evolution and natural selection of some of those species. So that's a problem if we don't take antibiotics correctly. All right, guys, that's it for me for today. Have a good day. I'll see you soon.